As we finish up with the prodigal son, I have to get up my courage to tell you about a very foolish man. I mean, this guy is really kind of dumb. I know that sounds crude, but wait until you hear about him. His name is Dr. Paul Brand, and I've mentioned him on radio broadcasts before, usually in a more generous vein. But here I'm telling you, he faced a crossroads in life and took a nasty and ill-advised detour down the wrong road. He got his degree in medicine back in 1946, right after the war ended. And he was talented, no doubt about that. He's written some good bestsellers and had a noteworthy career. But right there at the start, he just plain and simple made a wrong choice. Instead of starting up a lucrative practice in London, he got suckered into traveling back to the land of his birth and working in a hospital in Vellore, India. Now, his family couldn't come with him for a whole 6 months. So he was out there in the middle of nowhere all by himself. Secondly, Vellore in 1946 wasn't exactly the Johns Hopkins Medical Center. He lived in a tiny little cubicle, taking baths by dipping a ladle into the water and then splashing it on himself. And then there was the heat, 110 degrees all day, every day. Just breathing made a person sweat, he confessed later. Well, could he just switch on the air conditioning? Not in 1946, he couldn't. Nothing was air conditioned in Vellore, even in the operating room. In fact, with the risk of infection, he and his fellow surgeons and nurses didn't even dare to have fans going. So they would stand there, dripping wet with perspiration, doing one operation after another. Between each patient, they would go outside, step out of their sopping wet gowns, change into dry ones, and then head right back into the sauna for another operation. And this was for 12-hour days. In that kind of a climate, you really needed to drink at least 6 quarts a day. But Brand found that when he did so, he would break into a horrible prickly heat rash, which, if you scratched at it, would turn into boils and infection. A fellow doctor advised him that if he cut back on the drinking, he would develop kidney stones instead. So that was the choice, kidney stones or painful rash. And most of the medical people had to go through bouts of dysentery, hepatitis, influenza, and a local disease called dengue, more commonly referred to as break-bone fever, because for about a week you felt like every bone in your body was broken. Well, that's the choice this foolish, misguided doctor made. Instead of practicing medicine in Beverly Hills, he was out there in Vellore working for Jesus. That was what his missionary spirit had led him to do. As we think about the mathematics of God's kingdom and this story of the prodigal son, we haven't yet addressed the situation of the older brother, because all of the math in this story works against him, doesn't it? His younger brother takes half the family inheritance, goes to a faraway place and spends it like a drunken sailor. Then when he comes home, Dad simply rewrites the will so that he's back in it with a whole new inheritance. He scores twice. Meanwhile, his older brother, who had stayed on the farm, working away year after year, obeying the rules, towing the mark, gets nothing. Oh, he got the regular inheritance, but he had that coming anyway. And as he points out to his father, he'd never been given so much as a goat so he could have a little barbecue party with his friends. You know, several of these stories Jesus tells have a common theme where someone is a chump. In this story, it's the older brother. In another of Jesus' odd little tales, some guys work for the master in the vineyard all day, speaking of 110 degrees, and then get the exact same pay as those who just worked in the shade for 1 hour right at quitting time. So we surmise that these are the people who have served God the whole way. It's hot out there in the blazing sun of the mission field. And these men and women put in 60-hour weeks for maybe 50 years of service. And then they die, maybe of amoebic dysentery, and get a tiny little grave marker out in Bangladesh, while their counterparts are soaking in Hollywood jacuzzis. Peter, the disciple of Jesus, finally noticed that there were two kinds of people who were going to get into Jesus' kingdom. Suckers like himself, who put in a whole lifetime of work and obedience, and then people like this prodigal son. And contrary to some of the jokes you read in Christian magazines these days about who got to heaven and got a big mansion and who got there and had to sleep in a little chicken coop, Jesus Christ never talked about bigger houses for the faithful few. And so finally Peter asked him that very question. Hey, he protested, we've left everything to follow you. What's in it for us? In other words, if Calvary's gift of grace puts every single believer on the golden streets of the kingdom, then where's the extra reward for the older brother, for the missionary in India, for the person who works for God his whole life instead of just slipping in under the wire like the thief on the cross? I think we find some biblical understanding here by considering some of the characters we haven't addressed yet. And those are the servants of this estate owner. They live right there on the property. But they're not sons. Instead, they're there for a wage. They put in 40 hours a week, punching a clock, wearing their uniforms, protected by the company's dental health plan. And once a week, they get a check. Now, there's nothing wrong with this kind of a relationship, but it's not the same thing as being a son. Remember that when the prodigal son first thought of coming back home, he had no inkling that he might get to be a son again. But he might get to stay out back in the servants' quarters, where at least there was heat in the winter, air conditioning in the summer, and 3 good meals a day, and that Blue Shield health plan. And he knew down deep that his father, formerly father really, was a decent employer, fair, honest, reasonable. Working for Dad, actually he would probably have to call him Mr. Jones now, wouldn't be that bad. Compared to feeding these pigs, anyway. And that's what he went back home hoping to get, the relationship of an employee. When you think about it, the older son was actually more like an employee than a son, too. He obeyed, but he didn't enjoy it. He followed the rules, but didn't love the rule giver. He stayed on the farm because it was comfortable and because it was the status quo. And frankly, he stayed on the farm because he knew that he, too, had an inheritance coming. For him, those were the true wages. If he put in his time until Dad died and got the whole farm deeded to him, it would be a lot more than minimum wage. So it was worth staying. Deep down, this guy was a glorified employee who just happened to have the same last name as the boss. Morris Venden makes this observation. The elder brother was a good liver, but it isn't much fun being good in the way he was good. That kind of good living will put ulcers in your stomach and lines on your face because badness held in check is not goodness and never will be. You know, some of us run the risk of being servants instead of sons, too. Let me confess to you. I get a paycheck every couple of weeks from the church. I am paid from heaven's storehouses. I pay my rent and my grocery bill with money that, in a way, goes through heaven's financial savings and loan. And frankly, it would be rather easy, and surely a great tragedy, to begin to think of my evangelistic campaigns, my work on radio and TV, as just that, work. A medium-paying job for a 60-year-old man. A career where God is the boss and not the father, an employer rather than a friend. The older brother in this parable betrays his feelings with a nasty little remark in verse 30. He's angry about Dad giving his younger brother a robe and a ring and a feast, and he says so. But notice his language. When this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. Notice, not my brother. No, it's this son of yours. This older brother doesn't even consider this to be a family anymore. Dad is an employer. not a father. And he certainly doesn't claim this renegade as his brother. But the purpose of this parable is to lift up the joys of sonship. When you love Dad, really love him, then it's wonderful to be with him in his vineyard. The longer, the better. The more you get to serve with him, the more rewarding. Wouldn't you rather have the whole day with this wonderful Father than just the last hour? Better, don't you think, to work for a whole lifetime in joy for Jesus than just the last 15 minutes like the foolish thief on the cross? Really? Who's the lucky one? There's a surprising end to that story of Dr. Paul Brand, who made the dumb decision to go work in the steamy town of Vellore, India. This Christian wrote later, "Never had I felt so challenged and fulfilled. Some people look upon expatriate doctors in third world countries as self-sacrificing heroes. I know better. Most are having the time of their lives." For Dr. Paul Brand, you see, the heat and the mosquitoes and the sores and the endless surgeries were a mosaic of joy, because he was working for God and with God. Foolish? By the world's math, of course. Measured by heaven's yardstick, the man's a genius.